is your favorite cover band? Is it a local band? Your kid's band that they formed with their friends in their garage? Maybe it's an ABBA cover band or one of those corny bands that comes to your hometown every summer. My favorite cover band is Led Zeppelin. Is that too controversial? Well, as it turns out, the history surrounding cover songs in the music industry is a bit controversial on its own. Although cover songs are nothing new and a smart way to break into the music industry if you're a new and upcoming artist, the idea behind cover songs carries with them a history of discrimination and loss, especially in the 1950s and 1960s. So get ready, because this video is about to cover some pretty heavy topics. When we think about cover songs, we usually think about coffee house open mics or YouTube videos of cover songs. That one song that you've never been able to master on guitar, or that one cover song that you actually think is better than the original. Let me know down in the comments what cover song you think is better than the original. However, sometimes in the music industry, cover songs are a one-way ticket to fame and success. For aspiring artists, a surefire way to attract attention is to record a cover song. If you're lucky and your cover song gets attention, you could be attracting views from an already built-in audience. If this built-in fan base enjoys your cover, then they might just want to check out the rest of your stuff to see what else you have going on for yourself. When performing live, it's a great idea to perform a majority cover songs, especially if you are a very, very small artist. This is a great way to endear the audience to you. If you don't have even a small following and you're out performing for the first time, odds are even the most considerate patron of the venue is not going to be interested in listening to original music that they're not already familiar with from a small artist that they don't know. And so has been ever thus in the music industry. Covering well-known songs is a great way to get people to know who you are, to endear an already built-in audience to you, and to really strengthen your skills as a musician and as an artist. In modern day, it's a pretty harmless way of putting yourself out there. And it's also usually considered a compliment to the artist whose song that you're covering. Being a performer myself for many years, when I would work at venues, sometimes the venue would actually tell me what kind of music they wanted me to perform. They would ask me to play music from a specific artists that they knew that people who went to their venue were familiar with and enjoyed. In the 1950s, however, cover songs sort of had a completely different purpose. A statement that I see pop up online quite frequently, especially on TikTok, is the statement that Elvis and other artists like him stole music. To those unfamiliar with music industry practices, I seem to notice that this statement invokes visions of Elvis Presley running into a recording studio in the dead of night and stealing sheet music and then publishing cover songs that were originally written by people of color without giving any credit to them whatsoever, meaning that he got to reap the benefits of somebody else's work, again, without offering credit whatsoever. Well, the thing is that did sort of happen, but not really in the exact way that I seem to see a lot of people think it did. What if I told you the reality of the situation was actually much more complicated? So for those who don't know, when you cover a song, you actually have to get a license to cover that song. Even today in the modern music industry, you can't just release a song on Spotify, for example, a cover song that is, and not get a license to put that cover song out there. This is done as a way to protect the owners of the original track so that they still get royalties from any money that your cover may generate. But in the 1950s and 1960s, unfortunately, when it came to covering songs, it was still kind of the Wild West out there. And a lot of people took advantage of that. So let's do a little deep dive into the history of the music industry, and we'll see what covering songs meant back in the day, what it means now, and what responsibilities that we have as listeners. From the 1920s to the 1940s in the music industry in the United States, few Black artists were marketed to white audiences. The records produced for and by artists of color were called race records, and they primarily consisted of jazz, gospel, blues, rhythm and blues, etc. By the late 1940s, these records would be called rhythm and blues, and in the 1960s, they would be called the soul charts, etc., etc. It's an ever-evolving thing. As the public consciousness and awareness has changed, so has these titles. By the 1950s, however, something was stirring in the air. Combining the elements of jazz, rhythm and blues, boogie woogie, country music, and more, there was a new genre that was emerging on the scene. This new genre was different from what was popular in previous generations, with its loud and hard-to-ignore attitude of rebelliousness. What's more is that affluent white teenagers contributed to a large majority of this genre's audience, a genre that was primarily created by people of color. Record executives in the 1950s took careful notice of this shift. And with the economic boom happening in the 1950s that gave teenagers greater purchasing power, it was a shift that these record executives could not financially ignore. And so a few record labels started to ever so slowly, and I do mean ever so slowly, desegregate. One of these labels was Sun Records that was run by Sam Phillips in Memphis, Tennessee. Sam Phillips is often regarded as an early trailblazer when it comes to desegregating the musical climate of the 1950s, with his work with artists such as Howlin' Wolf, Bobby Blue Bland, Little Milton, Roscoe Gordon, and many more. Phillips not only saw the appeal of early rock and roll music earlier than most, but he also understood the importance of it, and he really wanted to share it with a larger audience. He wanted to give the genre its proper due, and sharing it with a larger audience at the time meant sharing it with the white demographic. Now, did Sam Phillips have good intentions here? Absolutely. But he may not have really been aware of exactly what he was doing here, or rather, what the repercussions of his actions would be. When an 18-year-old Elvis Presley walked into Sam Phillips's life and did a cover of Arthur Crudup's original song, That's All Right Mama, originally recorded and released in 1949, it was like a bomb went off. Elvis had been practicing in between recording sessions and had been using That's All Right Mama as a song to practice with. And Sam Phillips immediately saw the potential with Elvis's version. Elvis's version was upbeat, enticing, it pulled from rockabilly influences. And when combined with Elvis's charms, it was honestly kind of irresistible. Or at least it was to Sam Phillips. Elvis's version was not identical to Arthur Crudup's original version. Elvis's version was much faster, it was a bit more radio friendly as far as, again, someone like Phillips was concerned. When the cover song was released in July of 1954, it was immediately a success. Although not an instant national hit, the record sold 20,000 copies almost immediately. It certainly secured Elvis Presley's local fame and kickstarted what a lot of music historians consider to be the beginning of rock and roll. Or at least, again, the beginning of rock and roll in the mainstream. Today, the song is considered a rock and roll staple and is most commonly attributed to Elvis, not to Arthur Crudup, which is the problem. And this is the part where we're going to talk about why the situation is a little bit more complex than how a lot of people make it out to seem in conversations online. When Elvis's cover version was released in 1954, his version cited Crudup as the original writer on the record. So the original writer did receive credit. And technically, this should have also meant that he received monetary credit as well, aka royalties. But those royalties would never come for Arthur. Legal battles over these much-deserved royalties would last into the 1970s, with Arthur being owed well over $60,000 at one point. But this money never materialized. In 1970, Arthur Crudup is quoted as saying, "I was born poor, I live poor, and I'm gonna die poor." Unfortunately, his story is not a rarity in the music industry in the 1950s. Because record executives in the 1950s were aware of the power and the potential of rock and roll, and they were also acutely aware of the race of many of the performers and writers in this genre, they needed a way to market the music to a larger audience without isolating a huge chunk of their audience, aka white America. Through a combination of a fear of the audience's reaction as well as their own bigotry, these executives did not want to promote the black artists that were making this music in the first place. But if an attractive and charismatic white kid could do the exact same thing, that made it doable in their eyes. The story of Arthur Crudup and Elvis Presley does not exist in a vacuum. As I said, this was not a rare story in the music industry of the 1950s. Throughout Elvis's career, he would continue to benefit from music that he made that was usually not his own original music. And numerous other white artists, such as Pat Boone, who did covers of Little Richard songs, and to even some degree, some of our favorite artists from the 1960s, the Beatles, the Beach Boys, the Rolling Stones, I could go on here. They all owe a lot to the Black artists that had a huge part in creating rock and roll. And unfortunately, regardless of the intentions a lot of these artists had, they continued to benefit from an industry that prioritized their music over music made by people of color. And here's the thing. During his lifetime, Elvis Presley made it very clear who his influences were and where he got his style of singing from. He was not shy about this. Elvis was quoted as saying things such as, "If I ever had any ambition, it was to be Arthur Crudup." He obviously held these people in very high regard. Elvis gave verbal credit as well as credit on his records, which meant that they should have been receiving royalties, but in a lot of cases they didn't. So why does it sometimes feel like we're uncovering some sort of ancient lost history when we talk about the history of cover songs in the 1950s? Why do some people have such an issue acknowledging the obvious discrimination that was taking place back in the day? This, in part, is as much the fault of audience members as it is the record executives. While record executives were working from a point of having a strategy to market white artists over Black artists back then, many, even modern audiences, are quick to only promote the bands that they know and that they listen to without doing the extra digging to learn about the music that came before, the artists that came before. How many of you watching this video knew that Twist and Shout was a cover song that the Beatles did? That's kind of an easy one. But for all you Led Zeppelin fans out there, how many of you knew that Gallows Pole was a cover song? Because Lead Belly originally did Gallows Pole in the 1940s. How many of you here are familiar with Big Mama Thornton or Mississippi Fred McDowell or Arthur Alexander? Again, the list could go on and on. What makes this issue complicated is the fact that all of this stealing of music was actually done completely legally. And that's probably the most important thing you can take from this video. Copyrights were secured. Original artists were technically credited. And the bands and artists doing these covers were usually quick to share their love of these original artists with their audiences. There was very little stealing done as far as the literal definition of the word stealing. And that's the issue. Because back then, what was legal wasn't necessarily moral. This is why I believe it's really important to understand what people are talking about when they say that insert band here stole music. It's really important to understand the deeper meaning to statements like this. Now, there were some cases where certain bands and artists actually straight up did steal music, and I think that's part of where some of the confusion lies. Like in the case of Led Zeppelin, there's an entire Wikipedia page dedicated to all of the songs that Led Zeppelin claimed to have written, but then you find out through a little bit of digging that it was actually a blues song written and recorded in the 1940s or 1950s, or even earlier in some cases. So that's where it can get a little confusing, because there were bands that were obviously influenced by artists of color who were stealing music. But then we have bands that were securing all the copyrights, that were going through all the legal steps to be able to cover a song, that were giving proper verbal credit and sharing their love of these bands with audience members. And that was still part of the problem in stealing music, because they were being promoted over their Black counterparts. So once again, we're not saying that when an artist stole music, they were going into studios and taking sheet music and crossing out one name and writing their name on it, unless you're Led Zeppelin. What we are saying is that an unjust system allowed a select group of people to have a leg up over their contemporaries in an already highly competitive industry. This allowed these acts to advance much farther and much more quickly than their Black counterparts were able to. And it was absolutely a strategy on the part of record executives in the 1950s and 1960s. So moving forward, how do we as modern audiences and modern listeners respond to these great injustices? In truth, there's very little direct action that we can take as a modern audience. Most of these original artists have long since passed without ever receiving their proper dues or credit. What we do have power over as modern audiences, though, is spreading the word. We have the power and the ability, thanks to the internet, to research, to listen, and to learn. We have the ability to research these original artists and share their music on our social media, share it with our friends, share it with our family, to save them to playlists, to write about them, to make YouTube videos about them, and so on and so on. When people create art, they do it as a way to create something bigger than themselves. So it only fits that one of the most meaningful things that we can do as a modern audience is to continue the legacy of these original artists and insert them back into the conversation, to put them on these pedestals that their successors were on and the pedestals that they should have been on in the first place. Thank you for watching this video, you guys. I really hope that you enjoyed it. We did a bit of a deep dive here, and it did deal with some pretty serious and heavy topics. I hope that you guys learned something. I hope that you take this video and go and research your favorite artist's favorite artist. I've also made a playlist that we are going to be putting down in the description box that's going to be filled with these original artists and their songs so that you can listen to what these original songs sounded like before we had Elvis Presley covers and Beatles covers and so on and so forth. So do something cool today and go out and look up these original artists and learn some history. Thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye!